Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when someone tries to break your spirit, but your heart refuses to bend. In that instant, you discover who you really are and who truly loves you. CEO George Williams stood in his grand ballroom, champagne in hand, mocking Betty Applewhite, the maid who had raised his daughter for 15 years. "Dance this waltz, Betty, and I'll wed you," he laughed, while wealthy guests snickered at his cruel joke. Betty felt every stare burning into her worn uniform as shame washed over her face. But 8-year-old Millie gripped her hand tighter. "Dance with me, Betty, you're family," the child whispered. As the orchestra began playing, Betty took her first trembling step onto the marble floor. The room fell silent, watching this unlikely pair begin to waltz. What happened next would shock everyone in that ballroom and reveal a secret that would change George Williams forever. What could a simple dance possibly reveal that would leave a powerful man speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 15 years earlier, Betty Applewhite had arrived at the Williams estate on a crisp October morning, carrying nothing but a worn suitcase and a heart heavy with recent loss. Her husband Thomas had died in a construction accident just 3 months prior, leaving her with medical bills that consumed their modest savings and a future that seemed as grey as the autumn sky. At 28, she found herself starting over in ways she never imagined possible. The estate stretched before her like something from a magazine: manicured gardens, towering oak trees, and a mansion that spoke of generations of wealth. But it was the woman who answered the door that truly impressed her. Margaret Williams possessed the kind of grace that didn't need to announce itself. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back simply, and her eyes held genuine warmth as she welcomed Betty inside. "You must be Mrs. Applewhite," Margaret had said, extending her hand as if greeting an equal rather than a potential employee. "Please call me Margaret. I despise formality in my own home." The interview hadn't felt like an interview at all. Margaret served tea in delicate china cups and asked about Betty's life, her dreams, her loss. When Betty mentioned her love of reading and her attempts to finish her teaching degree before Thomas died, Margaret's eyes lit up. "Perfect," she'd said. "Millie will need someone who values education. My husband travels frequently for business, and I worry about her having enough intellectual stimulation." 3-year-old Millie had peeked around the corner during that first meeting, all blonde curls and curious blue eyes. She'd approached Betty without fear, offering a well-loved stuffed rabbit for inspection. "Bunny wants to meet you," Millie had announced solemnly. Betty had knelt to the child's level, accepting the rabbit with appropriate reverence. "Hello, Bunny. I'm Betty. What's your favorite thing to do?" "Tea parties," Millie had whispered conspiratorially. "Mama says real ladies have proper tea parties." Margaret had hired Betty on the spot. Those early years had been golden ones. Margaret treated Betty not as domestic help, but as a family friend who happened to live in their home. She encouraged Betty to continue her studies through correspondence. Courses, often sitting beside her at the kitchen table in the evenings, helping with assignments while Millie played nearby. George Williams had been different then too. He'd come home from business trips bearing gifts, not just for his wife and daughter, but thoughtful tokens for Betty as well. A book of poetry from Boston, a silk scarf from Chicago, always presented with a warm smile and genuine interest in her opinion. "Margaret tells me you're studying American literature," he'd said once, handing her a first-edition Whitman. "Thought you might appreciate this." The Williams family had felt like a gift after the loneliness of widowhood. Betty had her own comfortable room on the second floor, not in the servants' quarters, but down the hall from the family bedrooms. Margaret insisted she take her meals with them unless she preferred privacy, and her duties felt more like helping a friend than working for an employer. Betty's worn Bible, a wedding gift from Thomas, found its place on the nightstand beside her bed. Each morning she'd read a few verses before starting her day, finding strength in familiar words. The 23rd Psalm had become her anchor. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Millie had grown from toddler to little girl, under Betty's watchful care. They'd spent hours in the garden, learning the names of flowers. Betty had taught her to read before she started school, watching proudly as those tiny fingers traced words across pages. They'd baked cookies on rainy afternoons, played elaborate games of dress-up, and established the bedtime ritual of stories followed by prayers. "Betty," Millie had asked one evening as she brushed the child's hair, "will you always live with us? As long as your mama and daddy want me here, sweet pea." "Good," Millie had said with the certainty of childhood. "Because you're my family too." Margaret had been standing in the doorway listening. Later that night she'd knocked softly on Betty's door. "I want you to know," Margaret had said, settling into the reading chair beside Betty's desk, "that what Millie said tonight about family, George and I feel the same way. You're not our employee, Betty. You're part of our family." Those words had meant everything to a woman who'd thought her family days were behind her. But then came the diagnosis. Margaret's cancer appeared suddenly, aggressively. One day she was her vibrant self. The next, she was sitting in an oncologist's office hearing words like stage 4 and limited time. Betty had driven her to that appointment, holding her hand in the waiting room, both of them trying to stay strong for the other. George had fallen apart. His confident demeanor crumbled as he watched his wife grow thinner, weaker. He'd started drinking more, staying at the office later, anything to avoid facing the reality unfolding at home. Margaret had asked Betty to take over more of Millie's care during treatments. "She needs stability," Margaret had whispered during one of her bad days. "She needs someone who won't disappear when this gets harder." The promise had been unspoken, but understood. Betty would be there for Millie no matter what came next. Margaret had fought for 2 years, enduring chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments. Through it all, Betty had been her constant companion, driving to appointments, managing medications, keeping the household running smoothly so George could focus on his wife when he was present, which became increasingly rare as his grief and helplessness consumed him. In the final months, Margaret had spent hours talking to Betty about Millie's future. "George won't know how to be alone with her," Margaret had confided. "He loves her desperately, but he doesn't understand children the way we do. Promise me you'll stay, Betty. Promise me you'll help him learn to be the father she needs." Betty had promised, tears streaming down her face. The funeral had been magnificent and terrible. George had stood like a statue beside the graveside, accepting condolences with mechanical politeness. Millie, only 5 years old, had clung to Betty's hand throughout the service, not fully understanding why everyone was so sad or why Mama wouldn't be coming home. After that day, George began his slow transformation into someone Betty barely recognized. The man who'd brought her books and asked about her studies disappeared, replaced by someone bitter and distant. He hired additional staff to create barriers between himself and the life Margaret had built. Betty found herself relegated to the 3rd floor, her comfortable room reassigned to guests she never saw. Mrs. Henderson, the cook, had been George's first hire, a stern woman who ran the kitchen with military precision but showed unexpected kindness to Betty and Millie. James, the butler, arrived next, a dignified man in his 60s who understood the delicate dynamics of the household and treated Betty with quiet respect. Tom, the gardener, rounded out the new staff, maintaining Margaret's beloved flowers with the same care she'd once given them, but it was the small cruelties that cut deepest. George stopped acknowledging Betty's contributions, speaking to her only to give instructions. He scheduled business dinners during Millie's bedtime, leaving Betty to comfort a confused child who wanted to say goodnight to her father. He began, referring to Betty as the help when speaking to visitors, erasing years of family connection with casual dismissal. Betty's attic room became her refuge, filled with photos of Millie's milestones, first day of school, lost teeth, birthday parties. Her worn Bible remained her constant companion, though some nights the words seemed to swim through tears she wouldn't let Millie see. The child suffered most of all. Millie, now 8, had learned to navigate her father's moods, becoming quiet and careful around him. She'd ask Betty endless questions about her mother, treasuring every story, every memory Betty could share. Their bond deepened as George's presence in his daughter's life diminished. "Why doesn't Daddy love me anymore?" Millie had asked one night after George missed another school play. "Your daddy loves you very much," Betty had assured her, though the words felt hollow. Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to show love when they're hurting. "But you know how," Millie had said with devastating simplicity. "Yes, baby, I know how." It was this conversation that had led to Millie's drawing, a family portrait featuring herself, Betty, and notably excluding her father. When Betty had gently suggested adding Daddy to the picture, Millie had shaken her head firmly. "He doesn't live with us in the happy part of the house," she'd explained with 8-year-old logic. "You live with me in the happy part." Now, 3 years after Margaret's death, the Williams household operated like two separate worlds. George's world of business meetings, social obligations, and carefully maintained appearances existed downstairs. Upstairs, Betty and Millie created their own small universe of homework help, bedtime stories, and quiet conversations about everything and nothing. The other staff members watched this division with varying degrees of sympathy and concern. Mrs. Henderson would pack extra treats in Millie's lunch, her way of showing care without overstepping boundaries. James would find reasons to check on Betty and Millie, his presence a steady reminder that they weren't entirely alone in the big house. Tom would save the prettiest flowers for Millie to take to her mother's grave, a weekly ritual that George never joined. Tonight's charity gala represented everything George's life had become, a performance of success and social standing that bore no resemblance to the warm, authentic home Margaret had created. Betty had watched the preparations with growing unease, knowing that such events brought out the worst in George's current personality. The drinking, the casual cruelty toward staff, the need to perform his wealth and status for peers who neither knew nor cared about the broken family behind the facade. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when George's performance crossed the line into something unforgivable. The moment when his need to demonstrate power over others collided with Millie's fierce love for the woman who had raised her. The morning of the charity gala arrived with unseasonable warmth for late September, as if the universe had decided to provide perfect weather for what would become the most important evening of Betty Applewhite's life. She woke before dawn, as was her habit, and reached for her worn Bible on the nightstand. The leather cover, soft from years of handling, fell open to Psalm 31. "Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord." She whispered the words aloud in her small attic room, drawing strength from their familiar cadence. Today felt different somehow, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was simply the stress of managing a large social event. While caring for Millie, but something deeper stirred within her, a sense of approaching change. Down the hall, she could hear Millie beginning to wake up, the soft sounds of a child stirring in bed. Betty smiled, closing the Bible and padding quietly to the child's room. At 8, Millie still enjoyed elaborate morning rituals, and today would be special. Margaret's closest friend, Eleanor Patterson, had sent a beautiful dress for Millie to wear to the early portion of the evening before bedtime. "Good morning, sunshine," Betty whispered, perching on the edge of Millie's bed. The little girl's blonde hair fanned across her pillow like spun gold, so much like her mother's had been. "Is today the fancy party?" Millie asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Yes, sweet pea, and you get to wear that beautiful dress Mrs. Patterson sent." Millie's face lit up with excitement. "The blue one with the sparkles?" "The very one. But remember, you'll need to go to bed at your regular time. This is a grown-up party." "Can't I stay with you?" Millie's voice took on the pleading tone Betty knew so well. I'll be very good. I won't spill anything or talk too loud." Betty felt her heart clench. The truth was, she'd assumed she would be upstairs with Millie during the party, as she had been for every previous social event George hosted. Her role had always been clear: care for Millie while the adults entertained downstairs. But something in George's demeanor over the past few days suggested tonight might be different. "We'll see, sweetheart. Let's get you ready first." They spent the morning in pleasant preparation. Betty helped Millie into the exquisite dress, a confection of blue silk with tiny crystals that caught the light like stars. The child stood before her mirror, turning this way and that, delighted with her reflection. "I look like a princess," Millie announced. "You look like your mother," Betty said softly, remembering Margaret in a similar dress years ago. While Millie played quietly in her room, Betty went about her usual duties. She checked with Mrs. Henderson about the evening's menu, confirmed arrangements with the additional serving staff George had hired, and ensured the main floor was prepared for guests. James supervised the placement of flowers and the arrangement of furniture with his usual quiet efficiency. It was mid-afternoon when George emerged from his study, impeccably dressed in his tailored tuxedo. Betty was arranging programs for the evening's presentation when he appeared in the main hallway. "Betty," he said, his voice carrying that tone of authority she'd learned to dread. "There's been a change in plans for this evening." She looked up from her task, immediately sensing trouble. "What kind of change, Mr. Williams? I'll need you to work the party tonight. We're short-staffed, and I want everything perfect." Betty felt her stomach drop. "Work the party? But what about Millie? She's expecting to spend time with you before—" "Millie will be fine. She can watch from upstairs if she gets lonely." George's tone brooked no argument. "I need you in uniform, helping serve. This event is crucial for my business relationships." The dismissal was clear, but Betty couldn't let it go. "Mr. Williams, she's been looking forward to showing you her dress. Perhaps I could help for a short while, and then—" "Betty," his voice turned cold. "You work for me. Tonight I need you to work the party. That's final." He turned and walked away, leaving Betty standing in the hallway with her heart racing. This was different from his usual coldness. This felt deliberate, calculated to hurt not just her, but Millie. She climbed the stairs slowly, dreading the conversation ahead. Millie was in her room, practicing curtsies in her beautiful dress, humming a tune Betty recognized as one Margaret used to sing. "Betty, look how good I can curtsy now," Millie demonstrated with exaggerated grace. "Beautiful, sweetheart." Betty sat down heavily in the bedroom's small chair. "Millie, we need to talk about tonight." The child's face fell at Betty's serious tone. "What's wrong? Your father needs me to help serve at the party tonight. I won't be able to stay upstairs with you." Millie's eyes filled with tears. "But I wanted to show Daddy my dress, and you promised we could watch the dancing from the top of the stairs." "I know, baby, I know." Betty pulled Millie into her arms, feeling the child's disappointment like a physical ache. "Maybe your father will come up to see you before our party gets too busy." But even as she said the words, Betty knew they were empty comfort. George hadn't willingly spent time with his daughter in months. "I don't want you to work at the party," Millie said, her voice muffled against Betty's shoulder. "I want you to stay with me. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do," Betty replied, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. Later, while Millie napped fitfully, Betty retreated to her attic room to change into the black uniform George required for evening service. The starched fabric felt foreign against her skin after years of wearing her own clothes around the house. As she pinned back her hair and checked her appearance in the small mirror, she caught sight of something that made her pause. There, in the back of her closet, was an old jewelry box she'd nearly forgotten about. It had belonged to Margaret, left in Betty's room after one of their evening study sessions and never reclaimed. Curiosity overcoming her usual respect for privacy, Betty opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay Margaret's pearl necklace, the one she'd worn to special occasions, including her last anniversary dinner with George. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper in Margaret's familiar handwriting. Betty's hands trembled as she unfolded the note. "My dearest Betty, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found this box as I hoped you would. These pearls belonged to my mother, and they should go to someone who understands their true value, not their price, but their meaning. They represent grace under pressure, beauty that comes from within, and the strength to endure life's storms with dignity. You have been more than an employee to our family. You have been the daughter I never had, the sister I always wanted, and the mother Millie will need when I am gone. I pray that George will remember the man he used to be, but if he does not, know that you have every right to stand tall and claim your place in this family. Wear these tonight if you need to remember who you are. All my love, Margaret." Betty sank onto her bed, tears streaming down her face. The pearls seemed to glow in the afternoon light, and for a moment she could almost feel Margaret's presence in the small room. With shaking hands, she fastened the necklace around her throat. The pearls felt warm against her skin, as if they carried some essence of the woman who had worn them with such grace. Downstairs, the first guests were already arriving. Betty could hear the murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the sound of George playing the perfect host. Soon she would have to go down there to serve people who saw her as invisible, to smile and nod while they discussed their privileged lives. But tonight she wore Margaret's pearls. Tonight she carried more than just serving trays. Tonight everything would change. The Williams estate ballroom had been transformed into a glittering showcase of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, while hundreds of white roses, Margaret's favorite flower, created an ironic backdrop for an evening that would have horrified the woman who had once filled this space with genuine warmth and laughter. Betty descended the main staircase slowly, her hand trailing along the mahogany banister where she'd once helped Millie, practice walking as a toddler. The black serving uniform felt like armor, but Margaret's pearls pressed warmly against her throat, a secret reminder of her true worth. The guests were already arriving in their evening finery. Women in designer gowns air-kissed each other while their husbands discussed business mergers over imported champagne. Betty recognized many faces from previous gatherings: the Patterson family, the Rothschilds, various business associates and their wives. But tonight felt different. Tonight she would be serving them instead of greeting them as the quasi-family member she'd once been. George stood near the entrance, playing the perfect host, his smile practiced and hollow. He nodded to her briefly as she passed, a gesture that contained no warmth, no recognition of their shared history. To him, she was simply part of the evening's arrangements. Mrs. Henderson had prepared an elaborate spread in the kitchen, and Betty joined the other serving staff for final instructions. The temporary workers George had hired looked at her with curious recognition. They'd heard whispers about the live-in help who'd once been treated like family. "You sure you're okay with this, honey?" asked Maria, one of the regular caterers who'd worked previous Williams events. "Seems strange, them making you work tonight." Betty managed to smile. "I'm fine, it's just one evening." But as she lifted her first tray of champagne flutes, her hands trembled slightly. Through the kitchen door, she could see the ballroom filling with guests, could hear the orchestra tuning their instruments for later in the evening. This room held so many memories: Margaret's birthday parties, Christmas celebrations, the few occasions when George had seemed genuinely happy. She pushed through the swinging door and entered the world of the Williams social circle. Immediately, she felt the shift in how she was perceived. Conversations paused as she approached with drinks, resumed when she moved away. She'd become part of the background, functionally invisible, despite being completely exposed. "Excuse me," called a sharp voice. Betty turned to see Mrs. Rothschild, a woman whose pinched face perpetually suggested she'd tasted something unpleasant. "These champagne flutes have water spots. Surely you can do better than this." Betty examined the glass, which appeared perfectly clean to her eyes, but nodded politely. "I'll get you a fresh one immediately, ma'am." As she returned to the kitchen, she overheard fragments of conversation that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "Seems odd, doesn't it? Making the nanny work the party. Heard she practically raised that little girl. George has been different since Margaret died, more ruthless. Poor child, barely sees her father anymore." The whispers followed her as she moved through the crowd, carrying trays and clearing empty glasses. Some guests looked at her with curiosity, others with pity, a few with the kind of disdain reserved for those who'd fallen from grace. Eleanor Patterson approached her near the grand piano, her face kind but concerned. "Betty, dear, are you all right? This seems unusual." "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson, just helping out for the evening." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in Betty's forced cheerfulness. "Where is Millie? I brought her that dress specifically so she could join us for the early part of the evening." "She's upstairs. Mr. Williams thought it best." "Nonsense." Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. "That child should be down here, at least for a little while. It's what Margaret would have wanted." Before Betty could respond, Eleanor was already moving toward the staircase, her intentions clear. Betty felt a surge of panic. If Millie came downstairs now, in her beautiful dress, expecting to be part of the celebration, what would happen when she saw Betty in serving attire? She followed Eleanor upstairs, her heart racing. They found Millie in her room, still wearing the blue dress but sitting forlornly by her window, watching the cars arrive in the circular drive below. "Mrs. Patterson!" Millie's face lit up at seeing her mother's old friend. "Hello, darling. That dress looks absolutely perfect on you." Eleanor gathered the child into a warm embrace. "Now why are you up here when there's a party going on downstairs?" Millie glanced at Betty, uncertainty clouding her features. "Daddy said I have to stay upstairs, and Betty has to work at the party instead of staying with me." Eleanor's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Well, I think we can arrange for you to come down for just a few minutes. There are people who would love to see you. But Daddy said, Daddy will be fine with it," Eleanor said firmly. "Betty, surely you can take a few minutes away from serving to bring Millie down." Betty found herself caught between George's explicit orders and Eleanor's reasonable request. The memory of Margaret's note pressed against her consciousness, the reminder that she had rights in this household, that she was more than just an employee. "Of course," she heard herself say, "just for a few minutes." They descended the staircase together, Eleanor on one side of Millie and Betty on the other. As they entered the ballroom, several guests immediately noticed the child and approached. With warm greetings, Millie blossomed under the attention, curtsying prettily and accepting compliments on her dress with Margaret's natural grace. "She looks just like her mother," someone murmured. "Beautiful child, such poise for her age. Margaret would be so proud." George noticed their entrance from across the room. Even at a distance, Betty could see his jaw tighten, his eyes flash. With anger, he began making his way through the crowd toward them, his expression growing darker with each step. Betty's hands grew cold. She'd disobeyed him, and she knew there would be consequences. But watching Millie's joy as she interacted with people who remembered her mother, she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. "Millie," George's voice cut through the warm chatter surrounding his daughter. "What are you doing down here?" The child's smile faltered. "Mrs. Patterson said I could come down for just a minute, Daddy, to show everyone my pretty dress. I told you to stay upstairs." His voice was controlled but cold. Eleanor stepped forward, her own voice equally controlled. "George, surely you don't mind the child greeting your guests for a few moments? She's been looking forward to this all day." "What I mind," George said, his voice rising slightly, "is my staff ignoring direct orders." His eyes fixed on Betty with undisguised anger. A hush fell over the nearby guests. Betty felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized they'd become the center of attention. This was exactly what she'd tried to avoid, a public confrontation that would embarrass everyone involved. Mr. Williams, I apologize. Mrs. Patterson asked me to. I don't want to hear excuses. George's voice carried clearly now, drawing more attention from across the ballroom. You work for me, Betty. When I give you instructions, I expect them to be followed. The cruelty in his voice, the public humiliation he was orchestrating, struck Betty like a physical blow. But worse was watching Millie's face crumple with confusion and embarrassment. The child moved closer to Betty, seeking comfort, which only seemed to inflame George's anger further. Perhaps, he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that Betty had never heard before, you've forgotten your place in this household. It was in that moment, standing in the ballroom where she'd once been welcomed as family, that Betty felt something inside her begin to shift. The pearls at her throat seemed to pulse with warmth, and she could almost hear Margaret's voice. Grace, under pressure, my dear. Show them who you really are. The ballroom had grown quiet, conversations dying as guests sensed the tension building between George Williams and his staff. Betty stood frozen, acutely aware of every eye upon her, every whispered judgment being passed. Millie pressed closer. To her side, the child's small hand finding Betty's, with desperate need for comfort. George seemed to grow larger in the moment, feeding off the attention, his grief and bitterness finally finding a public outlet. The man who had once brought Betty books and asked about her studies was completely gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. You know what? George said, his voice carrying that dangerous tone that had become all too familiar over the past 3 years. Since you're so eager to be part of the party instead of doing your job, he paused, letting his eyes sweep across the watching crowd, ensuring he had their full attention. Betty felt a chill run down her spine. Whatever was coming would be designed to hurt, to humiliate, to put her firmly in what he considered her proper place. George walked to the nearest table and picked up his champagne flute, holding it aloft like a prop in his personal drama. The crystal caught the light from the chandeliers, sparkling with the same cold brilliance as his smile. Let's make this interesting, he announced to the room. Betty here seems to think she belongs in polite society, so let's see just how well she fits in. Eleanor Patterson took a step forward, her face flushed with indignation. George, what are you doing? This is hardly appropriate. Oh, but it's perfectly appropriate, George cut her off, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. You see, Betty has been part of this household for 15 years. She's watched us dance at parties, listened to our conversations, observed how proper people behave. I think she's learned enough to join us, don't you? The mockery in his tone was unmistakable now. Betty felt her cheeks burn with shame as she realized where this was heading. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruelty unfolding before them. So here's what we're going to do, George continued, raising his champagne glass higher. Betty is going to dance for us, right here, right now, and if she can waltz like a proper lady. He paused for dramatic effect, his smile turning vicious. If she can dance this waltz like she belongs in this room, then I'll marry her. Make her a real member of the family. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some guests looked horrified, others fascinated by the spectacle. A few uncomfortable chuckles emerged from men who'd had too much to drink and mistook cruelty for entertainment. Betty felt the blood drain from her face. The humiliation was complete, total. He was asking her to perform like a trained animal for the amusement of his guests, reducing her to a source of entertainment at her own expense. Daddy! No, Millie whispered, her young voice cutting through. The terrible moment with clarity. Don't be mean to Betty. Hush, Millie, George snapped, not even looking at his daughter. The adults are talking. But Millie didn't hush. Instead, she moved to stand directly in front of Betty, her small body forming a protective barrier between the woman who'd raised her and the father who'd become a stranger. Betty is family, Millie declared, her 8-year-old voice carrying surprising strength. Mama said so, and family doesn't have to dance for mean people. The ballroom fell completely silent. Out of the mouths of babes came truth that cut through all of George's posturing and exposed the ugliness of what he was attempting. Betty knelt down to Millie's level, her heart breaking at the child's attempt to protect her. "It's all right, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups—" "No, it's not all right," Millie interrupted, her blue eyes fierce with the kind of righteous anger only children can muster. "Mama wouldn't like this. Mama said you were the heart of our house." Eleanor Patterson stepped forward again, her voice sharp with disapproval. "George Williams, you should be ashamed of yourself. Margaret would be horrified by this display." "Don't you dare speak for my wife," George snarled. But even he seemed taken aback by his daughter's intervention. Robert Patterson, Eleanor's husband and George's business partner, moved to join his wife. "George, perhaps we should discuss this. In privately—" "No," George cut him off. "We're going to settle this right now. So Betty wants to be part of the family. Then she can earn it. Dance, Betty. Show us you belong." The orchestra leader looked uncomfortable, his baton suspended in mid-air, as he waited for some sign of how to proceed. The musicians shifted nervously, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Betty felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. The pearls around her neck seemed to pulse with warmth, and suddenly she could hear Margaret's voice as clearly, as if her former employer were standing beside her. "Grace under pressure reveals true character, dear. Show them who you are." She looked down at Millie, saw the tears in the child's eyes, the confusion and pain that George's cruelty was causing. This innocent little girl was being forced to watch her father destroy the only stable relationship in her young life, and all for the sake of his wounded pride. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor said quietly, moving closer to Betty. "No one should have to endure this kind of treatment." But as Betty looked around the ballroom, at the guests who watched with varying degrees of horror and fascination, at George with his cruel smile and raised champagne glass, at Millie with her tear-filled eyes and protective stance, she realized something profound was happening. This wasn't just about her humiliation. This was about choice. She could walk away, take Millie upstairs, preserve what little dignity she had left, or she could stay and show everyone in this room, including herself, that dignity couldn't be taken from someone who chose to keep it. "If I dance," Betty heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady, "I dance with Millie." "What?" George blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "If I'm going to waltz, I waltz with this child. The child I've raised, the child who calls me family." Betty's voice grew stronger with each word. "Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? Family. And who gets to decide what that means?" Millie's face lit up through her tears. "Yes, dance with me, Betty. Please." George's smile faltered. This wasn't going according to his script. He'd expected Betty to either refuse and flee in shame, or to stumble through the dance alone while his guests laughed at her presumption. The orchestra leader looked to George for direction, his baton still suspended in the air. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented moment would unfold. George's champagne glass trembled slightly in his hand as he realized his cruel joke had taken an unexpected turn. "Fine," he said finally, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "Dance with the child if you must, but you'll still dance, and everyone here will see exactly what you are." Betty felt Millie's small hand slip into hers, warm and trusting. The child's faith in her gave Betty strength she didn't know she possessed. She looked down at the little girl in the beautiful blue dress, saw Margaret's eyes staring back at her, and made her choice. "Maestro!" Betty called to the orchestra leader, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "The Blue Danube, please." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The Blue Danube was not a simple waltz. It was Strauss at his most elegant, a piece that demanded skill and grace. Several guests exchanged glances, wondering if the maid understood what she was asking. But Betty knew exactly what she was requesting. Years ago, on quiet Sunday afternoons, when George was away on business trips, Margaret had taught her to waltz in this very ballroom. They danced to that same piece, while young Millie clapped from her perch on the piano bench, delighted by the sight of her mother and Betty spinning gracefully across the marble floor. "You have natural rhythm," Margaret had said during one of their lessons, "and more grace than half the women in my social circle. Dancing isn't about money or status, Betty. It's about joy, about connection, about letting the music move through you." Now, standing before a crowd that expected her to fail, Betty closed her eyes briefly and let those memories wash over her. She felt Margaret's presence as surely as if her former employer were standing beside her, offering quiet encouragement. The first notes of the waltz began, tentative and soft. The orchestra, still uncertain about this strange turn of events, played with careful precision rather than passion. But as the melody built, something magical began to happen. Betty curtsied to Millie with the same formal grace Margaret had once shown her. Millie giggled and attempted her own curtsy, wobbling slightly but beaming with delight. Then Betty took the child's hands in the proper position, one on her waist, the other extended, and they began to move. The first steps were tentative, uncertain. Betty was acutely aware of every eye upon them, every whispered judgment. Her black serving uniform felt heavy and wrong against the elegance of the music. But Millie's joy was infectious, and gradually Betty began to relax into the familiar rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The basic waltz pattern Margaret had drilled into her years ago came back like muscle memory. Betty guided Millie through the steps, her hand gentle but firm on the child's waist, her voice soft with instruction only Millie could hear. "Follow my lead, sweetheart. Let the music tell your feet where to go." Around them, the ballroom began to transform. The harsh judgment, in some faces, softened into surprise. The mockery George had expected gave way to something else entirely. Recognition of genuine grace and beauty that had nothing to do with expensive gowns or social pedigree. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway leading to the kitchen, her stern face wet with tears as she watched Betty, the woman she'd come to respect despite their different roles, claim her dignity on the dance floor. James stood beside her, his usual reserved expression replaced by quiet pride. Eleanor Patterson watched with growing amazement, remembering now how Margaret had spoken of Betty's intelligence and natural refinement. "She would have made a wonderful teacher," Margaret had once said. "She has that rare gift of seeing the best in everyone." But it was George's face that underwent the most dramatic change. As Betty and Millie moved through the waltz with increasing confidence and grace, his cruel smile faded entirely. The champagne glass in his hand lowered slowly as he watched his daughter, the child he'd been neglecting for 3 years, absolutely radiant with happiness. Millie's laughter rang out clear and sweet as Betty lifted her gently through a turn. The child's face glowed with pure joy, the same expression she'd worn as a toddler when Margaret used to dance with her. For a moment, George saw his late wife's spirit alive in his daughter, nurtured and protected by the woman he'd been systematically destroying. The waltz gained momentum, and so did Betty's confidence. Years of watching Margaret's natural elegance, of absorbing lessons about grace and dignity, began to show in her posture, her movements, her quiet authority on the dance floor. She wasn't just surviving this moment, she was transforming it. "She's actually quite good," someone whispered near the back of the crowd. "Look at how happy the child is," another voice observed. "Margaret always said Betty was special," Eleanor murmured to her husband. "I'm beginning to understand what she meant." The serving staff had begun to gather at the edges of the ballroom, drawn by the music and the unprecedented sight of one of their own commanding the attention of the entire gathering. Tom the gardener stood with soil still under his fingernails, watching with fierce pride as Betty claimed space in the world that usually ignored people like them. But something else was happening too, something that went beyond Betty's personal triumph. As she and Millie danced, the rigid social boundaries that usually defined such gatherings began to blur. Several guests found themselves remembering their own children, their own relationships with the people who helped raise them. The artificial barriers between us and them started to feel less solid. George's business partner, Robert, watched with growing discomfort, recognizing the cruelty of what his friend had attempted. His wife, Eleanor's disapproval was obvious, and Robert knew this story would spread through their social circle within days. George Williams, the successful CEO, had publicly humiliated a woman who devoted 15 years to his family. It wasn't a good look for someone whose business depended on relationships and reputation. The waltz built toward its crescendo, and Betty felt something she hadn't experienced in years: pure, unqualified joy. Dancing with Millie, watching the child's delight, feeling the music move through both of them like a living thing. She remembered who she used to be before grief and loss had diminished her sense of self-worth. Margaret's pearls seemed to pulse with warmth against her throat, and Betty could almost hear her former employer's voice. "This is who you are, dear. This is who you've always been. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As the music swelled toward its finale, Betty made a decision that would change everything. Instead of ending the dance in the traditional manner, she began to guide Millie through the more complex steps Margaret had taught her in their private lessons, the advanced movements usually reserved for experienced dancers. The advanced waltz steps flowed from Betty's memory like water from a spring, each movement precise and graceful despite the years that had passed since Margaret's private lessons. She guided Millie through promenades and natural turns with the skill of someone who had been taught by a true lady of society. The child followed instinctively, her trust in Betty absolute, her face radiant with joy. Around the ballroom, conversations had stopped entirely. Even the serving staff had paused in their duties to watch this extraordinary moment unfold. The orchestra, initially hesitant, now played with growing passion as they recognized the skill being displayed before them. George Williams stood transfixed, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. The cruel joke he'd orchestrated was backfiring, spectacularly, revealing truths he wasn't prepared to face. As he watched Betty guide his daughter through steps that required both technical skill and natural grace, memories of his late wife began flooding back with painful clarity. Margaret, dancing with Betty in this same ballroom on quiet Sunday afternoons while he worked in his study, too busy to join them. Margaret's gentle voice explaining that breeding and class weren't about money or bloodlines, but about how one treated others. Margaret's final words about Betty being the heart of their home. Eleanor Patterson had moved closer to the dance floor, her eyes bright with tears and recognition. As the wife of George's business partner, she'd been present for many Williams family gatherings over the years, and she remembered now how Margaret had spoken of Betty, not as an employee, but as a dear friend who happened to live in their home. "Robert," Eleanor whispered to her husband, "do you remember what Margaret told us about Betty, how she wanted to finish her teaching degree?" Robert Patterson nodded grimly, his businessman's mind already calculating the damage George's behavior would do to their partnership's reputation. Margaret always said Betty was the most naturally elegant woman she'd ever met, said it was a tragedy she'd never had the opportunities she deserved. Their conversation was overheard by other guests, and whispers began spreading through the crowd, not the mocking whispers George had expected, but murmurs of growing respect and admiration for the woman who was transforming his attempt at humiliation into something beautiful. Betty felt the shift in the room's energy, sensed the way judgment was giving way to wonder. But her focus remained on Millie, on the child's bright smile and perfect trust. As they moved through a complex sequence of steps that would challenge experienced dancers, Betty realized she was no longer dancing Margaret's steps. She was creating her own, guided by instinct and love, rather than rigid social convention. The ballroom's marble floor seemed to sing beneath their feet as Betty lifted Millie into the elevated turns that were the hallmark of advanced waltz technique. The child's laughter echoed off the crystal chandeliers, pure and joyful. cutting through years of tension and bitterness like a blade of sunlight through storm clouds. Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched from the kitchen doorway. In all her years of service to wealthy families, she had never seen anything like this. A woman claiming her dignity, not through anger or defiance, but through grace and beauty that transcended social boundaries. James, the butler, stood tall, with pride, remembering countless small kindnesses Betty had shown him over the years. While George had treated the staff as invisible fixtures, Betty had always acknowledged their humanity, their worth. Now she was showing the entire gathering what real nobility looked like. But it was George's transformation that drew the most attention. His face had gone pale, and the hand holding his champagne glass shook visibly as he watched his daughter bloom under Betty's guidance. For the first time in 3 years, he was seeing Millie not as a painful reminder of his loss, but as the vibrant, joyful child she had always been when cared for by someone who truly loved her. The music began building toward its final crescendo, and Betty made a decision that would shock everyone in the ballroom. Instead of ending the dance in traditional fashion, she began leading Millie toward the spot where George stood, as if to include him in their celebration. The crowd held its breath, wondering if she intended to force a confrontation or extend an olive branch. But Betty's intentions became clear as she curtsied deeply to George while still holding Millie's hand, her movement a masterpiece of grace under pressure. "Thank you for the dance, Mr. Williams," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Your daughter is a natural. Her mother would be very proud." The words were spoken without sarcasm or bitterness, but they struck George like physical blows. Margaret would indeed be proud of Millie's joy, of Betty's grace, of the love that had flourished in his household, despite his neglect and cruelty. But Margaret would be ashamed of him, of the man he had become, of the way he had dishonored her memory by treating the people she loved as disposable. Millie ran to her father, her face glowing with excitement. "Daddy, did you see? Betty taught me to dance just like Mama used to. Wasn't it beautiful?" George looked down at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in months. Her happiness was infectious, her love for Betty obvious and pure. In that moment, he began to understand the magnitude of what he had almost destroyed. "It was beautiful, sweetheart," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion he'd suppressed for too long. Eleanor Patterson seized the moment, moving quickly to where her husband kept important papers in his briefcase during social events. She had remembered something, a conversation from years ago, a document Margaret had mentioned in passing. If her memory was correct, George's public humiliation was about to become something far more serious. "George," Eleanor called, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I believe there's something you need to see, something Margaret left for you." All eyes turned to Eleanor as she approached with a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "I found this in the library just now, behind Margaret's books. It's addressed to you, but it's marked to be opened only in the presence of witnesses." George's face went from pale to ashen. He recognized Margaret's handwriting, remembered now the sealed documents his lawyer had tried to discuss with him after the funeral, papers he'd dismissed as unimportant, too consumed with his own grief to deal with legal formalities. "What is it?" someone whispered. Eleanor held the envelope toward George with steady hands. "I believe it's Margaret's final instructions regarding the care of your family, instructions you may have ignored." The ballroom fell completely silent. Even the orchestra had stopped playing, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Betty stood frozen, still holding Millie's hand, unsure whether to flee or remain for whatever revelation was coming. George stared at the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. He had a terrible feeling that his wife, even in death, had anticipated his failures and taken steps to protect the people she loved from his worst impulses. George Williams stared at the sealed envelope in Eleanor Patterson's hands as if it contained his own death warrant. The yellowed paper bore Margaret's familiar, elegant handwriting, and the weight of 3 years' worth of ignored responsibilities seemed to press down upon him all at once. "I don't understand," George said, though his voice lacked conviction. Deep down he remembered his lawyer Thompson's persistent phone calls after Margaret's funeral, the stack of documents he'd shoved into a drawer unopened, too consumed with grief and whiskey to deal with legal formalities. Eleanor's expression was grave as she studied the envelope. "It's sealed, George, but there's a note on the outside. It says, 'To be opened only if George fails to honor my final wishes regarding the care of our family and household.'" A collective intake of breath swept through the ballroom. The guests, who had come expecting a routine charity gala, now found themselves witnesses to what appeared to be a family crisis of epic proportions. Betty felt her legs tremble beneath her. Whatever was in that envelope, it involved her. She could sense it with the same instinct that had warned her this evening would change everything. "Where exactly did you find this?" Robert Patterson asked his wife, his legal mind already working through the implications, behind Margaret's medical journals in the library. It was wedged between 2 books about... Eleanor paused, checking. The envelope again. About custody law and estate planning. George's champagne glass slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held the room captive, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. "Someone should call Mr. Thompson," suggested a guest who knew George's family lawyer. "He's probably still in the city," another voice offered. "His office isn't far." "I'm here," came a familiar voice from the ballroom's entrance. Mr. Thompson, George's long-time attorney, stood in the doorway looking disheveled and out of breath. "I've been trying to reach you all week, George. When I heard about tonight's party, I knew I had to come." The elderly lawyer pushed through the crowd, his briefcase clutched tightly in his arthritic hands. When he saw the envelope in Eleanor's possession, his face went pale. "Oh, George," Thompson said sadly. "She knew. Margaret knew this day would come." "What are you talking about?" George demanded, though his voice cracked with fear. Thompson set his briefcase on a nearby table and opened it with shaking hands. 3 months before Margaret died, she came to my office. She was very ill, very weak, but absolutely determined. She said she needed to make provisions, just in case. "Provisions for what?" Betty whispered, though she wasn't sure anyone heard her over the murmur of the crowd. "For the possibility that grief might consume your judgment," Thompson said, looking directly at George. "She was afraid that after she was gone, you might forget the promises you made to her about Betty and Millie." The words hung in the air like an accusation. George stumbled backward, his face a mask of shock and growing horror. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged glances that spoke volumes about what they'd witnessed tonight. Thompson continued, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "She made me promise that if you ever, and I quote, failed to treat Betty Applewhite with the love and respect due a family member, I was to immediately implement her contingency plans." "What contingency plans?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Thompson reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick legal document. "Margaret's supplemental will. It contains provisions that were sealed until triggered by specific circumstances. Based on what I've heard about tonight's festivities, those circumstances have been met." Betty felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Millie's small hand squeezed hers tighter, the child sensing the adult's distress without understanding its source. "What does it say?" Robert Patterson asked, his businessman's instincts taking over. Thompson adjusted his glasses and began to read. "In the event that my husband, George Williams, fails to honor his promise to treat Betty Applewhite as a beloved family member, and particularly if he subjects her to public humiliation or treats her as mere hired help, the following provisions shall take immediate effect." The ballroom had grown so quiet that Thompson's voice carried easily to every corner. Betty could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. First, Thompson continued, Betty Applewhite is hereby granted full legal guardianship of my daughter, Millicent Williams, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. This guardianship cannot be revoked without Betty's consent and a court order proving unfitness. Gasps rippled through the crowd. George staggered, as if he'd been physically struck. She can't do that, he whispered. Millie is my daughter. Second, Thompson read on, his voice growing stronger. Betty Applewhite is granted immediate ownership of the estate property known as the Rose Cottage, along with an irrevocable trust fund in the amount of $2 million to be used for her own needs and for the care and education of Millicent Williams. The numbers hit the gathering like thunderclaps. $2 million. More than enough for Betty to live independently, to raise Millie in comfort, to never again depend on anyone's charity or cruelty. But Thompson wasn't finished. Third, should George Williams contest these provisions in any way, full custody of Millicent Williams shall pass immediately to Betty Applewhite, and an additional trust fund of $5 million shall be established for the child's future, removing her entirely from her father's financial control. Complete silence fell over the ballroom. Betty felt as if she couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was hearing. Margaret had anticipated all of this. The grief, the bitterness, the potential for George to lose himself in his pain and lash out at the people who loved him most. There's more, Thompson said quietly. Margaret included a personal letter. He reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a sealed envelope with Betty's name written across it in Margaret's flowing script. This is for you, my dear. She made me promise to deliver it personally if this day ever came. Betty's hands shook as she accepted the letter. Around her, the ballroom full of wealthy guests watched in stunned silence as their entire understanding of the Williams family hierarchy crumbled before their eyes. With trembling fingers, Betty broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Margaret's words, written in her final weeks of life, seemed to glow on the paper. My dearest Betty, if you are reading this, then George has forgotten the man I married and the promises we both made to you. I am so sorry, darling. I had hoped. His love for Millie would keep him anchored to his better nature, but I know too well how grief can poison even the kindest heart. You are not reading this by accident. Every legal provision I have made, every protection I have put in place, was designed to ensure that you and Millie would never be separated, never be made to feel less than the family you have always been to us. You have given our daughter 15 years of devoted love. You have been her mother in every way that matters, and I will not allow George's pain to destroy that bond. Take Millie, raise her with the same love and wisdom you have always shown. Teach her to be strong, to be kind, to never forget that worth comes from within, not from circumstances. The money is not charity, Betty. It is an inheritance rightfully yours, payment for years of love freely given. Use it to build the life. You deserve the life you would have had if fate hadn't taken your husband so young. George may contest these provisions. He may rage and threaten and try to use his wealth and connections to override my wishes. Do not let him. Fight for Millie. Fight for yourself. Fight for the family we chose to create together. You are my daughter in every way that matters. I love you, and I am proud of you, and I trust you completely with the most precious thing in my world. All my love, always, Margaret. Tears streamed down Betty's face as she read the final words. When she looked up, she saw that she wasn't the only one crying. Mrs. Henderson sobbed openly at the kitchen entrance. James wiped his eyes with his white gloves. Even some of the guests, people who had watched the evening's cruelty unfold, wept for the love and foresight of a dying woman who had protected her chosen family from beyond the grave. George Williams stood in the center of his own ballroom, surrounded by his peers and social circle, completely undone. The woman he had tried to humiliate now held legal rights that could remove his daughter from his life entirely. The cruel joke he had orchestrated had triggered the very protections his wife had put in place to guard against his worst impulses. George, Thompson said gently. Margaret hoped it would never come to this, but she was prepared for the possibility. The question now is, what are you going to do? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. George Williams stood in his opulent ballroom, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, while every eye in the room watched for his response. The legal documents in Thompson's hands represented more than just his late wife's final wishes. They were a mirror reflecting the man he had become versus the man he had once been. Betty clutched Margaret's letter to her chest, feeling the weight of 15 years settling around her. Like a mantle. Beside her, Millie looked up with confused blue eyes, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding its implications. "Daddy?" Millie's small voice cut through the tension. "Are you sick? You look like you did when Mama got sick." The innocent question struck George like a physical blow. His daughter's concern, her instinctive compassion, even after witnessing his cruelty, revealed the depth of his failure as both a father and a human being. Eleanor Patterson stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "George, perhaps we should discuss this privately. These are family matters and—" "No." George's voice was hollow, defeated. "No. Everyone here tonight has witnessed what kind of man I've become. They deserve to hear what happens next." Thompson adjusted his glasses nervously. In 40 years of practicing law, he had never been involved in such a public unraveling of a family's private affairs. "George, the legal implications are complex. If we're going to implement Margaret's provisions, there are procedures." "Tell me," George interrupted, his eyes never leaving Betty's face. "Tell me exactly what my wife arranged." Thompson opened his briefcase again, withdrawing additional documents. "The Rose Cottage is a 3-bedroom home on the estate's eastern boundary. Margaret had it completely renovated 2 years ago, ostensibly as a guest house, but the paperwork shows it was always intended for Betty and Millie." Betty remembered the cottage, had often walked past it during her evening strolls with Millie. She'd wondered why Margaret had invested so much time and money in renovating a building they rarely used. "The trust fund," Thompson continued, "is managed by an independent firm. Betty would have complete access to the income, with the principal protected for Millie's future education and needs. There are no restrictions on how Betty chooses to use the funds." Robert Patterson's business mind was working through the implications. That level of financial independence means Betty could live anywhere, raise Millie however she sees fit. "George, you'd essentially become a visitor in your daughter's life, assuming Betty allowed it." The words hit their target. George's face crumpled as he realized the full scope of his potential loss. Not just his social standing or his reputation, but his daughter, the only remaining connection to the woman he had loved more than life itself. Mrs. Henderson had moved closer, standing now with the other household staff who had gathered to witness this historic moment. Her usual stern expression had given way to something softer, more hopeful. "Miss Betty," she said quietly, "whatever you decide, we want you to know you've got our support, all of us. We've watched you love that little girl like your own for 15 years. We've seen how you've held this family together when it was falling apart." James nodded his agreement. "The house hasn't been the same since Mrs. Margaret passed, but you've kept the heart of it beating, especially for little Miss Millie." Tom, the gardener, stepped forward with dirt still under his fingernails from his evening work in Margaret's rose garden. "Mrs. Margaret, she told me once that you were the best thing that ever happened to this family. Said you had more class in your little finger than most folks had in their whole body." Their words, spoken with the quiet dignity of people who had watched and served and understood the true dynamics of the Williams household, carried more weight than any legal document could. George listened to his staff, people he had barely acknowledged for 3 years, speak about Betty with the kind of respect and affection he had systematically destroyed. Their testimony was damning, not because they spoke against him, but because their love for Betty highlighted the void where his own humanity used to be. Millie tugged on Betty's hand, her young voice piping up with innocent clarity. "Betty, Are we going to live in the pretty cottage? The one with the blue shutters and the flower boxes? I don't know yet, sweetheart, Betty replied, her voice thick with emotion. There are a lot of things we need to talk about. But even as she spoke, Betty was struggling with the magnitude of her situation. The woman who had arrived at the Williams estate 15 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart now found herself with legal guardianship of the child she loved, financial independence beyond her wildest dreams, and the power to determine the future of the family that had defined her adult life. Eleanor Patterson approached Betty with careful steps, recognizing the overwhelming nature of the moment. My dear, you don't have to make any decisions tonight. These are life-changing circumstances, and you deserve time to process everything. But she does need to understand her options, Thompson interjected, his lawyer's mind focused on the practical aspects. Margaret's will is ironclad. Betty could leave tonight with Millie, and George would have no legal recourse to stop her. Or she could choose to stay and work out some kind of arrangement. The power is entirely hers now. The reversal of fortune was complete and stunning. Betty Applewhite, who had been serving champagne to these very guests hours earlier, now held more legal authority over the Williams family than George himself. George seemed to age years in the span of minutes as the reality of his situation sank in. The cruel joke he had orchestrated, forcing Betty to dance for his amusement, had triggered the very protections Margaret had put in place to guard against his worst impulses. She knew, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Margaret knew I would do this. She knew grief would turn me into someone she couldn't recognize. Robert Patterson placed a hand on his business partner's shoulder. George, Margaret loved you. These provisions weren't created out of spite. They were created out of love. Love for Betty, love for Millie, and yes, love for you too. She was trying to protect everyone, including you from yourself. But I've gone too far, George said, his voice breaking. I've become exactly the kind of man she was trying to protect them from. The ballroom, which had been filled with music and laughter earlier in the evening, now felt like a courtroom where George Williams was both judge and defendant. The society guests who had come for entertainment found themselves witnesses to a man's complete moral collapse and potential redemption. Betty looked at the letter in her hands, at the legal documents that would give her everything she'd never dared to dream of, at the child whose hand remained trustingly in hers. Then she looked at George, the man who had brought her books and asked about her studies, who had been transformed by grief into someone capable of casual cruelty. Mr. Williams, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. Your wife asked me to make you a promise 15 years ago. She asked me to help you learn to be the father Millie deserved. George looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. I kept that promise for as long as I could, Betty continued, even when you made it impossible, even when you forgot who we used to be to each other. But tonight, her voice grew stronger, more certain. Tonight, you forced me to choose between my dignity and my safety. You made that choice in front of your daughter, in front of people who have known us for years. The condemnation in her words was quiet but absolute. George understood that he was facing not just the legal consequences of his actions, but the moral judgment of someone whose opinion had once mattered to him deeply. I know, he whispered. I know what I've done. The question is, Betty said, her voice carrying the authority that Margaret had always known she possessed, what are you going to do about it? George Williams stood before the assembled crowd, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled from the evening's emotional turmoil, his carefully maintained facade completely shattered. The question Betty had posed hung in the air like a challenge, demanding not just an answer but a choice about what kind of man he would be for the remainder of his life. Thompson reached into his briefcase one final time, withdrawing a sealed envelope that looked different from the others, smaller, more personal, with George's name written in Margaret's increasingly shaky handwriting. There's one more thing, the lawyer said softly. Margaret left this for you. Specifically, George, she made me promise to give it to you only if this day came, only if you had truly lost yourself to grief and bitterness. George stared at the envelope as if it contained his own judgment day. His hands trembled as he reached for it, and Betty could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the battle between the man he had become and the man he had once been. "Read it aloud," Eleanor Patterson said gently. Margaret's words brought us all here tonight. Perhaps they can show us the way forward. George's voice cracked as he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Margaret's handwriting, weakened by illness but still unmistakably hers, seemed to glow in the ballroom's crystal light. "My beloved George," he began, then stopped, overcome by emotion. He cleared his throat and tried again. "My beloved George, if you are reading this, then the man I married has lost his way. The George Williams I fell in love with would never humiliate someone who had devoted her life to our family. I see the darkness growing in you, my darling. I see how you look at Betty sometimes, not with gratitude for her devotion, but with resentment that she gets to stay when I have to go. But George, my love, I didn't choose to leave you. Cancer chose for me. And Betty didn't choose to survive when I couldn't. Fate chose for her. The anger you feel isn't really directed at her. It's directed at a universe that seems cruel and unfair. I understand that anger, darling. But I also know something you seem to have forgotten. Love is a choice. Every day, in every moment, we choose whether to let love or fear guide our actions. You have a choice now. You can let grief turn you into someone I wouldn't recognize, someone our daughter will learn to fear instead of love. Or you can remember who you really are, the man who brought home books for a widowed maid because he saw her hunger to learn. The man who cried the first time he held his newborn daughter. That man is still there, George. Choose love, my darling. Choose to see Betty not as a reminder of your loss, but as a gift I tried to leave you. Choose to be the father she deserves, the man I married. I will love you always, no matter what you choose, but I pray you choose love. Forever yours, Margaret. George's voice broke completely on the final words, and the letter fluttered to the marble floor as he collapsed into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. The ballroom fell silent, except for the sound of his sobs. Deep, wrenching sounds from a man who had held back 3 years of grief. Millie, confused by the adults' tears, but instinctively responding to her father's pain, pulled away from Betty and approached George's chair. With the fearless compassion that only children possess, she placed her small hand on his shoulder. "Daddy," she said softly, "why are you crying? Are you sad about Mama?" George looked up at his daughter through his tears, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Her blue eyes held no judgment, no resentment for the father who had become a stranger. They held only love and concern for his pain. "Yes, baby," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I've been sad about Mama for a very long time, and I've been angry and mean because I didn't know how to be sad without hurting people." Millie nodded solemnly. "Betty says when we're sad, we should talk about it instead of keeping it locked up inside. She says feelings are like steam in a kettle. If you don't let them out, they make everything boil over." George looked across the room at Betty, who stood with tears on her cheeks. In that moment, he saw her as Margaret had always seen her, as family, as the woman who had raised his daughter with wisdom and love while he had lost himself in grief and bitterness. "Betty," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. I'm so terribly sorry for what I've become, for what I put you through tonight, for forgetting everything Margaret tried to teach me about love." Betty stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, Margaret's letter still clutched in her hands, watching the complete breakdown of the man who had tormented her for 3 years. The apology hung in the air between them, raw and desperate. But she had been hurt too deeply and too consistently to accept it easily. Around them, the society guests watched in fascination and discomfort as one of their own stripped himself bare of pretense and pride. Some shifted toward the exits, uncomfortable. With such naked emotion in a setting meant for polite socialization, others remained transfixed, witnessing what felt like a fundamental transformation of human character. Eleanor Patterson moved closer to Betty, her voice gentle but urgent. "You don't have to forgive him tonight, dear. You don't have to forgive him at all. Margaret's provisions ensure you never have to depend on his goodwill again." But as Betty looked at George, truly looked at him for the first time in years, she saw past the cruel man he had become to glimpses of the person Margaret had fallen in love with. She saw the way his hands shook, not just with emotion, but with fear, the way his eyes sought Millie's face as if his daughter were a lifeline back to his humanity. Most importantly, she saw how Millie stood beside her father without fear, offering comfort with the same generous spirit Betty had tried to nurture in her for 8 years. "Mr. Williams," Betty said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, "an apology is just words. Margaret's letter talks about choices, about choosing love over fear. What are you choosing?" George lifted his head, meeting her eyes, for the first time since Margaret's death, without the barrier of anger or resentment clouding his vision. "I'm choosing to fight for my family," he said. "Not against you, not against Margaret's wishes, but for the chance to be the father Millie deserves and the friend you used to trust." Thompson cleared his throat delicately. "From a legal standpoint, George, that means accepting Betty's guardianship of Millie and working within the parameters Margaret established. You would essentially be asking Betty to allow you back into your daughter's life." The reversal was complete and stunning. George Williams, one of the city's most powerful businessmen, was now dependent on the grace of the woman he had tried to humiliate. "I know," George said simply. "I know I've lost the right to make demands or set conditions. I'm asking, begging for the chance to earn back what I threw away." Betty looked down at Millie, who was still standing between her father and herself, like a bridge between two different worlds. The child's face held hope, but also wariness, the protective instincts of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly in adult promises. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Betty asked Millie quietly. "Your daddy says he wants to try to be better. Do you think we should give him a chance?" Millie considered this with the seriousness only children can bring to adult problems. "If he promises not to be mean to you anymore," she said finally, "and if he promises to read me stories like he used to before Mama got sick." George's face crumpled again at his daughter's simple conditions. Reading bedtime stories. Such a small thing. But he couldn't remember the last time he had tucked Millie into bed or shared the quiet intimacy of children's books and whispered goodnights. "I promise," he whispered to his daughter. Then, looking at Betty, "I promise both of those things and more. I promise to get help, real help, for the grief and anger that turned me into someone Margaret wouldn't recognize." Betty felt the weight of decision settling upon her shoulders. She could walk away tonight, take Millie to the Rose Cottage, and build a new life free from George's darkness and instability. Margaret's provisions would ensure their comfort and security. She would never again have to endure his cruelty or worry about his moods, affecting the child she loved. But as she stood there, surrounded by the remnants of the evening's drama, she thought about Margaret's final words about choosing love over fear. Fear would tell her to protect herself and Millie by leaving, by taking the easy path that Margaret had provided. Love, the harder choice, would mean staying, would mean believing that people could change, that families could heal. "I'll make you a deal," Betty said finally, her voice carrying the authority that Margaret had always known she possessed. "We'll try. All three of us together. But there are conditions." George nodded eagerly. "Anything. You get professional. Help for your grief. Real therapy, not just promises to do better. You treat me as an equal partner in raising Millie, not as an employee you can dismiss when I become inconvenient. And if you ever speak to me or treat me the way you did tonight, I take Millie and we leave permanently. No second chances, no explanations, no legal battles. We disappear from your life completely." The terms were harsh but fair. George understood that he was being offered something precious, the chance to rebuild his relationship with his daughter, and to honor his wife's memory by becoming the man she had always believed he could be. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." Thompson began gathering his papers, relief evident on his weathered face. "Then I suggest we meet tomorrow to discuss the practical arrangements. Betty, you'll want your own legal representation to ensure your interests are protected." But Betty was no longer listening to the lawyer. She was watching George kneel down to Millie's level, his hands gentle as he touched his daughter's face. "Can you forgive your old dad for forgetting how to be happy?" he asked her softly. Millie threw her arms around his neck, and for the first time in 3 years, George Williams held his daughter close and let himself feel joy instead of fear at loving someone he might lose. 6 months later, the Williams estate ballroom had been transformed once again, but this time the change ran deeper than mere decoration. The space that had once hosted exclusive gatherings for George's business associates now welcomed families from the community for monthly charitable events, just as Margaret had always dreamed. Betty Applewhite stood near the grand piano, watching as Millie helped other children learn basic waltz steps on the same marble floor where their own lives had been forever changed. The child had grown taller over the winter, her confidence blooming under the steady love of 2 adults who had finally learned to work together as partners rather than adversaries. "She has your grace," George said quietly, appearing beside Betty with 2 cups of tea. The simple gesture, bringing her refreshment instead of expecting her to serve others, represented just one of the countless small changes that had marked their journey toward healing. Betty accepted the tea gratefully, noting how much healthier George looked these days. Regular therapy sessions had helped him process his grief in constructive ways, while daily involvement in Millie's life had given him purpose beyond his business empire. The hollow, bitter man who had orchestrated that terrible evening was becoming a memory, replaced by someone who resembled the person Margaret had originally fallen in love with. "She has her mother's grace," Betty corrected gently. "I just helped her find it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as Eleanor Patterson demonstrated a turn sequence to a group of elderly residents from the local senior center. The monthly community dances had become tremendously popular, bringing together people who might never otherwise cross paths in the rigidly segregated social structure of their city. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the kitchen, her stern expression softened by genuine pleasure as she supervised the volunteer servers, many of them society wives who had initially balked at the idea of actually working at charity events rather than simply writing checks. "The buffet's ready," she announced to Betty and George. "Though I still say it's peculiar watching Mrs. Rothschild actually serve food instead of complaining about it." Betty smiled, remembering the gradual transformation of their social circle over the past months. Word of the dramatic events at George's gala had spread quickly through the community, creating a legend that grew more elaborate with each retelling. But rather than destroying George's reputation, the story had ultimately enhanced it. The tale of a man who had lost his way in grief but found redemption through humility and love. 5 minutes until the presentation," James announced, his dignity intact despite wearing a name tag that read "Dance Floor Monitor." He had embraced his expanded role in the household with characteristic grace, becoming something between a butler and a grandfather figure to Millie. The presentation James referenced was tonight's main event, the announcement of the Margaret Williams Memorial Foundation, which would provide educational scholarships for women who had been widowed young and wanted to return to school. Betty had finally completed her teaching degree through night classes, and the Foundation's first scholarship would allow her to pursue the graduate work she had always dreamed of. George approached the microphone that had been set up near the piano, his hands steady as he prepared to address the gathered crowd. 6 months ago, public speaking had terrified him. Too many opportunities to say the wrong thing, to reveal the ugly person he had become. Now, with regular therapy and a rebuilt family to anchor him, he felt ready to honor his wife's memory properly. "Friends, neighbors, family," he began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom. "6 months ago, many of you witnessed something in this room that I'm not proud of. A man so consumed by grief that he forgot everything his wife had taught him about love and dignity." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The story had become local legend, but few had expected George to reference it so directly. "Tonight, I want to tell you about the woman who saved our family twice. Once when she came to work for us 15 years ago, and again when she chose forgiveness over justice after I had lost my way completely." Betty felt heat rise in her cheeks as all eyes turned to her. But George's words weren't embarrassing. They were healing, both for her and for the man who spoke them. "Betty Applewhite could have taken my daughter and disappeared from my life forever," George continued. "She had every legal right to do so, and every emotional justification. Instead, she chose to stay and help me remember who I used to be. She chose to believe that people can change, that families can heal, that love is stronger than loss." Spontaneous applause broke out, led by Eleanor Patterson, and quickly spreading through the room. Betty saw tears in many eyes, people who had watched their community torn by tragedy and rebuilding itself through grace. The Margaret Williams Memorial Foundation exists because my wife understood that education is the key to independence, and independence is the foundation of dignity, George said as the applause faded. But it exists in this form because Betty understood that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the work. As George announced the foundation's first recipients, 5 women who would receive full scholarships to complete their degrees, Betty felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened widow who had arrived at the Williams estate with nothing but hope and determination had become someone who could create opportunities for other women facing similar challenges. After the formal presentations ended and the dancing resumed, Betty found herself back on the ballroom floor, but this time as an equal partner rather than a performer in someone else's cruel theater. George had asked her for the honor of a dance, not as a joke or a humiliation, but as a celebration of how far they had all come. As they moved through the familiar steps of the Blue Danube, the same waltz that had marked her transformation, from victim to victor, Betty reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. Margaret's pearls, which she wore tonight, not hidden beneath a servant's uniform, but openly as a cherished inheritance, seemed to pulse with warmth against her throat. "Thank you," George said quietly as they danced, "for staying, for believing, for showing Millie what real strength looks like." "Thank you," Betty replied, "for learning how to choose love." Around them, the ballroom filled with laughter and music, families and friends celebrating not just charity but community, not just survival but transformation. And in the center of it all, 3 people who had nearly lost each other to grief and pride danced together, their steps marking the rhythm of redemption, the music of second chances, and the endless possibility that love could indeed conquer all.